So please welcome, all the way from the Bay Area, Jim Tierney.
All right. So I will be going over a portion of the webinar that I did, just some of the tips and tricks as far as time-lapse goes, specifically talking about why you should shoot RAW and stabilization. But the first thing I'm going to go over is one of our plugins. So Digital Anarchy is a developer of plugins. We do plugins for After Effects and Final Cut and Resolve and Avid and all the different host apps that are out there. We've been around for about 14 years at this point. NAB was our 14-year anniversary, amazingly enough. We just came out with a product called Flicker Free, and so that's what I'm going to talk about. We can take a look at the short demo reel that we have for it. And so this was originally designed for time-lapse. It's designed to be a pretty easy to use plugin. There's really only a number of parameters. Part of the reason that we developed this was that I shoot a lot of time-lapse, and I was pretty unhappy with the products that were out there. And so it works for time-lapse, but it's also a whole bunch of different types of problems that it solves. Slow motion footage suffers from flicker a lot. As you mentioned, like LED lights and fluorescent lights get a lot of flicker. Computer monitors do that, as well as older footage. And so what we're looking at right here is a shot that has a problem with some sort of lighting. The camera is not in sync with the lights, and so you're getting this sort of rolling bands type of flicker. You see it pretty commonly with a whole bunch of different types of lights. It's also very common with slow motion. But this is one of the things that Flicker Free solves. If I turn this on and use the rolling horizontal bands presets, it's kind of aimed at LED lights, but actually it works for all sorts of lights. And I play that back, you can see it takes care of it. Yeah, we released this about a month and a half ago, and it's been really well received. We've had a lot of people actually send us. Yeah, it works in Premiere. Right now it's After Effects, Premiere, and Final Cut. Both, yeah. Well, when I say everything we do is for 7 and 10, so lots of people out there using 7, but lots of people love X, so got to keep everybody happy. And then we're coming out with it shortly for Avid, Resolve, and all the other open effects hosts like Assimilate, Scratch, and Nuke, and that type of thing. So that's essentially what it does. We can actually show you the NAB reel, which has a bunch of footage from our other product called Beauty Box, which is a pretty awesome tool for doing skin retouching. And actually, I think I'm going to skip through the Beauty Box part. Although if you haven't seen Beauty Box, it's a pretty great plugin. Again, something that's very easy to use. Sort of our design philosophy is that plugins should be simple. They should be, the software should be doing the work. You shouldn't have to do a lot of analyzing histograms and analyzing things. Some of the flicker stuff may or may not show up so well on the big screen, but that's the before, that's the after. And there's actually a really nice shot of this that is split. We'll look at that. So this is slow motion. And this is the time-lapse stuff. And we'll talk more about that in a second. So those are some of the examples that we have for it. Like I said, it's really easy to use. We have free trials online, so if you don't believe me that it's really easy to use, please download the demo and see if our presets do work as advertised. It's got a few parameters. The sensitivity is really aimed at telling the plugin how wide of an area the flicker is happening over. So with time-lapse, you want to have a large area, like 30-ish. Because with time-lapse, the flicker is coming from the exposure of the camera, and so it's affecting the entire frame. Whereas quite frequently, if you have lights flickering, it's really just affecting a region of the frame. And so a little bit lower value is usually what's better. So sensitivity just sort of defines the region. The time radius is telling flicker-free how many frames it's going to look at before and after the current frame. So in this case, it's looking at 6 frames after and 6 frames before and analyzing a total of 13 frames. And all of this happens on the fly. You don't have to do any sort of pre-analysis. There's no histograms to analyze. Once you start rendering, that's really all you need to do. Usually a good range for this is between 8 and 10, around 8. And then threshold is really specifying the amount of flicker that's happening. So if you have most footage that flickers is sort of in the 5 to 20% range in terms of brightness. You don't usually see something that's wildly flickering, but that's what that controls. So there's a few parameters in there to kind of dial it in for your footage if the presets don't work exactly, but that's really about it. So very simple to use. The 2 things I'm going to talk about tonight is shooting RAW versus JPEG, and you should shoot RAW, in my opinion. JPEG has a couple advantages, mainly that they're small file sizes. So if you're shooting a time lapse, usually you can get away with a 4 gigabyte or certainly an 8 gigabyte card. Whereas if you're shooting RAW, obviously the files are huge, and so you're looking at like a 32 gigabyte card or a 64 gigabyte card if you want to capture enough images. And also with JPEGs, it's easier for the host apps to process them, so you have faster rendering times when you finally do render it out to a movie. So that's great, but there are some pretty massive downsides to JPEG. The first of which is when you're shooting JPEG, the camera makes a whole bunch of decisions for you. So if we compare the JPEG versus the RAW, you can see the JPEG is much higher contrast. It's a little bit darker. When you're shooting RAW or when you're shooting JPEG, the camera is figuring out, making some color correction decisions for you, some noise reduction decisions for you. And usually it's pretty good, but that go away, thank you. Usually doesn't do a bad job, but it may or may not be the decisions you actually want. And so having that control with RAW is, I think, very valuable. And then there's the one other issue, which is really what sold me on using RAW. And so let's zoom in on our nice starry night here. So you'll notice we have lots of stars here, and many stars are red and they are blue. But if you'll notice down here, we have some very, very saturated stars. Stars don't usually look like that. And that's because they're not actually stars. They're dead pixels on your sensor. And they're evil, 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 evil. And if you're shooting JPEG, they are baked into it. And because they're on the sensor, they don't move. And so if you have things moving across the sky or moving across the image in your time lapse, they're going to look pretty unnatural. One of the great things about RAW is that the RAW processors get rid of them. So dead pixels, no dead pixels. Yeah, I believe so. I mean, to be honest, I don't know exactly what, and I'm running this through Adobe Camera Raw. I haven't actually tested it in other ones, but I'm pretty sure that the other processors get rid of it as well. So I don't actually know exactly what they're doing, but it's magic, and I like magic. So I'm down with that. If it gets rid of the dead pixels, which, it's like, again, are just a huge headache if you've got this, long time lapse and suddenly there's little UFOs just kind of sitting there in the middle of your sky. So, that's kind of that was the big selling point for me. And of course, pulling it into Adobe Camera Raw, you have just lots of other, let's jump over into After Effects, which is mostly what I'm going to be showing it in. And we can actually import it. Oops. Speaking of JPEG. So let's open this up. And of course, the great thing about RAW is you have all these color correction controls that you can adjust, initially when you import the footage, and pretty much at any other time. So you have, color correction, you have noise reduction, you have, the lens corrections, correcting barrel distortion. So lots of great reasons to be using RAW. And all this stuff is available to you if you're using it within After Effects or Premiere. Final Cut will import a RAW image, but I don't believe there's any way of getting this sort of control on it. And also the other problem with Final Cut is that it doesn't import image sequences, which to me is a huge thing. If you aim it at 1,500 sequentially numbered files, it will import 1,500 still images. There are some ways to kind of work around it, but they're kludgy, and it's really not it's not a great workflow. So it's kind of mystifying why they don't support image sequences, but they don't. San Francisco Embarcadero, shooting the Bay Bridge with the moon coming up behind it. They did something really nifty to the Bay Bridge about a year ago and added some lights to it. So you have a whole light performance happening on the bridge once the sun goes down. This doesn't exactly capture it. It's much more interesting than this, but it really is kind of a beautiful thing. So nice little time lapse. What was that? This one was about an hour and a half, and I had about 960 photos. I did one that didn't come out quite as well the next night. That was like 1,400 or so. So that's going to be our final version. And so the problem that you have one major problem you have with shooting time-lapse is stabilizing the camera, especially if you're shooting outdoors. There's a whole bunch of things that, let's switch over here. There's a whole bunch of things that are going to cause the camera to shake. And so you really want to you can stabilize something if you're shooting during the day. It becomes much harder to stabilize something that was shot at night in post. Because if you've got a shaky camera at night, usually you've got a long exposure happening, and you're going to end up with light trails and blurriness and other stuff. I mean, if you're shooting during the day and the camera shakes around, that you can fix in post, and that's what we're going to talk about using After Effects. But if you're shooting into the night, then you really want to be careful about making sure the camera is as steady as possible. And so there's a bunch of things that come into that. You want to make sure you're on stable ground. The shot that I just showed you was shot from a pier. It was a nice concrete, solid pier, but you always have to be concerned about waves hitting it, or in this case, we were very close to the Embarcadero, so there's trucks driving by and stuff like that. You want to make sure that you protect it from wind. So if you can position the camera next to a wall or a big rock or something, that's always helpful. If you have a lot of wind, you become the wind block. And yes, I have stood in front of my camera for about 2 hours, reading my phone or whatever, preventing the camera from shaking around. If you have rain, you also get to be the butler for your camera with an umbrella and stand there for a couple hours like that. Super fun. So yeah, it's very important to keep it stabilized. You can weigh the camera down, or you can weigh the tripod down. Usually there's a hook on the center pole of the tripod. If you want to attach a sandbag that's actually, on the ground. You don't want something hanging from it, obviously. If it's just a weight and it's just hanging from the pole and there's wind, it's going to blow it, which is not going to help you out very much. And that goes for also the controller that's attached to the camera. You don't want the strap attached to it. That can blow in the wind as well and cause problems. And also tripods usually have different types of feet, either pointy ones for soft surfaces like dirt, or rubber feet for harder surfaces like wood or concrete or something like that. So all these things help out with the stabilization. But even with all that, you can see that things shake. And we'll do a little RAM preview here. And even though I claim to know what I'm doing, my footage still shakes. So what to do about that? After Effects has a really awesome stabilizer built into it. Yep. Oh, I see.
It's because of the projector.
Yeah, it's a projector. So under the effect menu, what's that? All right. So it's under the effect menu, under Distort, and it is the Warp Stabilizer VFX. Premiere also has this. It's a different version of it. The one in After Effects is a little bit better. It has some additional features in it. So if you do have After Effects, it's a little bit better place for using it. I think because After Effects is a compositing program, it's a little bit more suited to doing this type of work, but you can certainly use Premiere, or once you render the footage out to a movie, you can also use Final Cut, of course. So with the Warp Stabilizer, you have a couple different types of options here. In this case, we want no motion. It is a time lapse. We want the camera completely locked down on the tripod. And so in this case, we want no motion. We don't necessarily have to worry about the subspace warp stuff. Yes, exactly. It's the Star Trek version of the stabilizer. Really, in the case of time-lapse, because the camera's on a tripod, you're probably really only having to worry about the camera moving along the X and Y axis. If it's moving in the Z axis, that's your tripod's probably falling over. Yes, exactly. I don't. I mean, I think there's a little bit of a breeze. Like I said, it's very close to the Embarcadero, which is a main street in San Francisco. So, large trucks will shake the ground. Any sort of, gust of winds will cause it. So. Earthquakes, yes. Not really. I mean, right there, you're really next to the Embarcadero, so you're pretty well protected from the way. I mean, there were some, but nothing that should shake a concrete pier. What was that? No. Okay. Okay. That's entirely possible.
The mirror goes up and down, it moves the rest of the camera. So if you put the mirror up when you start, the mirror doesn't move. You have a lot less movement.
Okay. Well, that's no, it's a short lens. Yeah, this is it's the Canon 24 to 105, and pretty much wide open.
We'll try to hold the questions because we only got about 8 minutes.
Okay. Well, actually, I'm almost wrapped up. In the case of time-lapse, we don't really need to worry about, we don't want it auto-scaling. We don't want it to, part of what the stabilizer is designed to do is if you have a handheld shot and you're moving around, it's designed to stabilize that shot. And in a lot of cases, it will scale the footage to make that stabilization happen. That's not the case with time-lapse. So we really just want it to either just stabilize only or stabilize and crop. And then down at the advanced section, you want to turn on detailed analysis. And what this does is makes for a finer analysis of it. So it takes longer, but it does a lot more processing to try and really nail down what how it should be stabilized. And for time-lapse, again, because we want the camera locked down on the tripod, we want it as just rock steady as possible. Now, the one thing I did find out about this, as good of a stabilizer as it is, when I analyzed the entire 30-second or so clip, I still had some shake in there. And you'll notice that you're getting this bar across here. The first thing that this does is analyze the footage, analyzes the entire thing. And so that's the first process, and then once that's done, you'll actually see it stabilized. But what I ended up doing was breaking the footage up into about 5 or 6 second chunks and applying the stabilizer to that. And that actually gave me a much better stabilization than doing the whole clip all at once. I think mainly because if you take a look at, let's take a look at this guy. We can turn the show track points on, and you can see, let's make them a little bit larger. So these are all the track points that the stabilizer automatically placed. So it's automatically looking at your footage, trying to figure out things that it knows are going to be, it can identify, and tracking all those things throughout the footage. And the great thing about this is that even if some of those track points change, it still has all the other ones to help it figure out what's going on. This is much, much better than the old method of stabilization in After Effects, where you essentially had 2 points, you had to figure out what the points were, and you had to hope those points didn't change too much over time. As you can imagine, if you're doing a sunset shot, the points in your footage are likely going to change a lot. As the sun goes down, you're looking at things that were illuminated going into complete darkness, and things that didn't exist before coming up, the lights primarily. So this is a really awesome tool that it used to require a lot more work for me to stabilize shots, and I love the warp stabilizer. It's great.
So there's no noticeable jump between those separate segments?
There is. So you do have to go in there and sort of line up, tweak it a little bit. But if it's a 10-minute shot, this is maybe a little bit less practical. But most time-lapse shots are really 30 seconds, a minute, or so. And you're going to get, and just going in there and lining them up is pretty easy. So it's, as long as you don't have too many of them. But the one thing about that is you want to start from the last one, because if you start with the first one, well, I guess it just depends on how you're lining them up, but you need to pay attention that as you adjust one for, if I'm adjusting this one, that it's going to remain lined up with whatever's behind it or in front of it. But yeah, so you can see what that looks like after it's been stabilized. So looks great, except we have the flicker happening. And so, of course, being from Digital Anarchy, I applied flicker free to it, surprisingly. And ended up with a shot that I showed you in the end, but here's a split version of it. Yeah, that's just the exposure. One other thing that I do also is that I tend to cap, if I'm doing like a day to night thing like this, I set manual mode up to cap how long the exposure is going to be. So if I want it eventually to just stop at 3 seconds or 5 second exposures, I'll set manual up to the aperture that I have and 3 seconds, and then because I'm using aperture priority, because what's happening is I'm locking down the aperture and letting the camera automatically adjust the shutter speed. And so that's what's causing the flicker in the first place. And if you want to do a day to night scene like this, you have to have the camera on semi-automatic mode. But then once you get to a certain point, you want to cap the exposure unless you want to go all the way out to 30-second exposures or whatever. But you want to cap it, and so at some point, once the automatic shutter speed gets to 3 seconds, then I just turn the dial to manual, and it just locks it down at 3 seconds for the rest of the clip. And you can see that it does a pretty nice job. So that's it.
Thank